Greetings and a warm welcome from me, astrologer Patrick Arundell, to your year 2024 astrology forecast. I'm just going to outline how I'm going to approach this video. Now, in October 2023, we have two eclipses, a solar on the 14th, a lunar on the 28th, that last in a series between the signs of Taurus and Scorpio. But then as we go into the new year, at that exact moment that 2024 begins, we can take a snapshot of where all the planets are. And that provides us with our collective solar return. And the energy of those two eclipses will make their way into the first quarter of the year, but the energy from that solar return will be prevalent for the following 12 months. I'm then going to go on and share with you what Mercury is going to be doing this year. It's going to be going through 4 fire sign retrogrades, but 1 brief Earth retrograde in the sign of Virgo. Of course, we've got Pluto making its way back into Aquarius on the 21st of January, which has particular significance, which I will outline. I'm also going to share with you the key dates throughout the year, not least when the North Node in Aries for the whole of this year links with Chiron in the last week of February. That could be a very potentially healing moment for us all. But then we have a lunar eclipse, a mirror of the Libra solar eclipse, which occurs on the 25th of March. And that provides a backdrop energy which feeds into the following 6 months. But it's followed by a solar eclipse on the 8th of April in Aries, where of course we have the North Node and also Chiron. But Mercury is retrograde at that time in this sign and pretty close to this eclipse, only 5 degrees away. So that also is going to be a pulse which really is very important through the following 6 months. And then Jupiter, which is in the sign of Taurus right through to the 26th of May, and forges an incredible link to Venus on the 23rd. I can't wait to share that in detail with you. That can be really very fortunate. Well, Jupiter then makes its way into the sign of Gemini. It's going to speed up. It's much more to do with the communicational cycle rather than resources, but it can create a lot of excitement. Now, through the summer months, we do have Mercury going into Leo, then going into Virgo, then back into Leo in the retrograde. So we get a bit of a stop-start period, but by the 18th of September, we get a new eclipse series, this time in the sign of Pisces. So this is accentuating the signs of Virgo and Pisces. And the position of Neptune is very, very close to that lunar eclipse, which occurs on the 18th, and that is going to be particularly influential. Then on the 2nd of October, we get the second solar eclipse in the sign of Libra, repeating the first one on the 14th of October, but this one's very close to Mercury, and therefore our communicational approach is going to be critical in the last quarter of the year, a time when Mercury then goes back into Sagittarius, but back into retrograde. And we also have Mars punching into Leo, but also itself going into retrograde as the year comes to a close. And Mars only goes into a retrograde every 2.5 years. So there's so much information to share with you. If you do want to know what your year 2024 horoscope forecast is, please see the link beneath this video and you can watch my deep dive for each of the 12 signs. But before I continue, I want to share a very exciting opportunity with you. If you order your year 2024 personal horoscope forecast in year 2023, I will provide the rest of 23 free of charge. But also in my special package of 30% off, you can get your character analysis, your life roadmap, which helps you to understand all the patterns which play out in your situation and get a much more intimate understanding of how to work with the positive strands and how to grapple with those awkward elements that we all have in our lives. Please see the link below for more. But if you do order your forecast in year 2024, you'll still get the 30% off. You still get the character analysis, but I'll produce the forecast for a full 12 months from the time of your order. So let's take a look at those two eclipses which occur in October 23, but are going to be really influential in the first quarter of the new year. The first occurs in the sign of Libra, very close to the South Node on the 14th of October. Libra is a sign that's very much to do with fairness, to do with balance, can be to do with how we relate, but also how we present ourselves. But that solar eclipse needs to interact with the last of a series of eclipses in the signs of Scorpio and Taurus, and we have a Taurus lunar eclipse which occurs on the 28th. Now, Taurus energy is very much about everyday resources, but it's also about self-worth and our values. So as we go into the new year, I feel after the big pressures that we've all been faced with over the last 18 months in terms of the financial crunch, the cost of living crisis, what we're looking for is to try and find a better equilibrium between the ins and the outgoings, but also a sense of appreciation for where we put effort in and how people feel about that commitment in terms of how they value us. So that sense of fairness is going to be important, but we also need to be very realistic about the reality of the world as it is, which of course is fast changing, have a lot of robotics, a lot of digital services, and of course a lot of artificial intelligence. So that gives you a flavour. As we come into the new year, we can have that higher principle of wanting fairness, balance, relationships that work for both sides, but it needs to also work in a very earthy, practical way through the values of the sign of Taurus, which is about our self-worth and finances. Now that takes us to the turn of the year, and on the screen now I'm sharing with you the solar event chart. So we're looking at this event in terms of how we can all relate to it collectively. So I've parked the ascendant at 0 degrees Aries, which is the vernal point, because that's where the Western tropical zodiac begins. And you can see the big takeouts from this chart is that we have the sun, as we always do at this time of year, at 10 degrees and 2 minutes in the sign of Capricorn, and it's in the 10th house. Capricorn energy is very much about traditionality, it's about continuity, it's about a degree of stability and security, but it also can be to do with wisdom. And we also have Pluto, the planet of transformation, just only by a few minutes still in the sign of Capricorn too. So I think that what this points towards is continuing transformations around the way business is conducted. But there's a great link between the sun and Jupiter, and you can see that Jupiter is in the sign of Taurus. So that's giving support to that lunar eclipse, because Jupiter is about expansion, it's about positivity, can be about trade, especially international trade. The sign of Taurus hosting Jupiter slows down its more over-optimistic energies, makes it a bit more realistic. But you can see at 10:02 for the Sun and 5:34 degrees for Jupiter, we have nearly a trine. Now, some astrologers will include on an important aspect like this a gap of up to 10 degrees, but I usually like to work in a much tighter way, and you can see that this is about 4 degrees, so very, very close. But the Sun trine Jupiter, trine is a 120 degree angle, is one of the most fortunate in astrology. So with Jupiter in house 2, everyday money and our self-worth, and the position of the Sun in Capricorn in house 10, very much our work, the way we connect with the world at large, our responsibilities and obligations, that's a really solid, in 2 earth signs, a solid but very positive trine. So I think that speaks helpfully to some of the challenges we've all gone through over the last 18 months. But then if you look at house 6, we have the moon. The moon's in the sign of Virgo, which is very much to do with precision, order, organization. But the moon in the sign of virtue can also be very much to do with getting clearer about how we live our everyday life, but also perhaps what we consume in terms of our emotions. So if we can get our diet and physical exercise, because the 6th house is very much about the body, a little bit better, we clean up our act a little bit, that's a lovely position for the moon. And guess what? It's in a perfect trine with Jupiter. So Jupiter and the moon is giving us fortitude. It gives us a sense of positivity that we can make things better and more stable for ourselves. But the moon then links back to the Sun. And again, just like Jupiter, it's not an exact trine, but it's getting there. It's pretty close. So what we have is a grand Earth trine that takes us into this new year and is going to be reverberating out behind us for the whole of the following 12 months. So I think if we can be a bit more disciplined, the moon in Virgo, a bit cannier with our resources, a bit thriftier, but also look for opportunities, Jupiter in Taurus, but also take into our thinking and our approach some of those traditional old world approaches of reliability, punctuality, self-discipline, being mindful of how our approach does impact on others as well. This is a really lovely bedrock aspect that is really going to be helping us all throughout year 2024. So I think it does speak to an improvement around the financial climate, which is really exciting. Now, another reason why I'm quite optimistic in that regard is that if we look at the position of the moon at 5 degrees and 59 minutes in Virgo and the position of the Sun's very much about our outer world. It's how we're manifesting our desire and our passion. The moon's very much about our inner world, how receptive we are, how much we keep a sense of security and protectiveness. Well, the midpoint between the two is at 8 degrees in Scorpio. And Scorpio is the sign of longer term finance. So the lovely thing about the position of this midpoint, which is, if you like, the balance, the yin yang that we can expect this year, is that there is going to be some transformation, as there often is with the sign of Scorpio. Sometimes it can be reluctant because it's a fixed sign, therefore it likes a degree of continuity. But if you look at the position of Jupiter, it is nearly opposite that midpoint. So I think because of that, Jupiter's on the descendant of the overall personality of this chart, and that suggests how we interact with each other can actually be a source of inspiration, particularly around resources. So I think because Scorpio is very much to do with things like savings, investments, pensions, shares, can be property, and obviously rentals and mortgages have gone up a lot, and that's been really challenging. But I think Jupiter, speaking back to that midpoint, says that there is some cause for real optimism about how we can go forwards. So those are the big takeouts in terms of the earth energies and the water energy, but in the 8th house, very spiritual and psychological, quite a mysterious location for that midpoint, but in a more practical way, good for handling resources wisely. So let's look at house 9, because interestingly, we have 3 planets all in the sign of Sagittarius. And of course, house 9, very redolent of the energy of Sagittarius, which is about discovery, expansion, enthusiasm, travel, foreign connections and trade. It can also be to do with our higher philosophies, but it's very much to do with freedom and independence too. So quite a contrasting energy to those earth links through that grand earth trine and that midpoint in the water sign of Scorpio. And one of the things that we can see is that Mars is in the sign of Sagittarius. If we all want to get a little bit fitter and more active this year and be a little bit more robust in our approach to our exercise, Mars is definitely giving us an opportunity to step up and really get our heart rate working quicker. But we also have Mercury very close to the position of Mars, and you can see that Mercury is in a retrograde. So this is really very important, because Mercury is actually detrimented in the sign of Sagittarius, and it's also very close to Mars. So what we can see is at times this year, we will see the quite earnest expression of ideas. And that could mean that some people are going to be a little bit impatient in terms of getting their viewpoints across. Nothing new there, I guess, seeing how social media has developed in recent years. But if we are wanting to travel or be more pioneering or more freedom orientated, we have to be aware of the details, because Mercury here can be a little bit too sure of itself, a little bit too caught up with the Jupiterian energy of Sagittarius, and go for situations without giving them due diligence, and therefore I feel that can be quite an impatient combination, and it could see some fierce discussions in the year ahead when people have very different and conflicting viewpoints and world views, because Sagittarius is very much about the big picture. But you can also see that we have Venus, the planet of love, relating and presentation through its rulership of Libra, but the planet of self-worth and money, sensuality, food and drink of its rulership of Taurus. So in the sign of Sagittarius, Venus likes to be quite the free spirit. And so if we're thinking about our resources splashing out, or we're thinking about our love life, maybe there is part of us that does want a degree of doing our own thing. So in itself, Venus in Sagittarius could be quite exciting. It's just that those three positions are all conflicted by two positions in the 12th house of this solar return. And the 12th house is, of course, Pisces. The first is Saturn, and that's in an exact square with Venus. And Neptune, the planet of dreams, but also the planet of projection, the planet of mysticism, is in a square with Mars and also Mercury. So what we're going to get here at times, I feel, is that the more emotional component that Saturn and Neptune are asking us to look at can in some ways be conflated with the more expansive energies of those three players, with the Mercury retrograde, detrimented as it is in Sagittarius. So it could mean that we are defending ourselves at times, or discussing things in a very protective but proud way through that Sagittarius energy, when we need to be more mindful of our wound and the things we need to work on psychologically, which is what Saturn is really asking us to do over the next couple of years. And of course Neptune has been asking us to engage with our more spiritual potential since 2012, when it first moved into Pisces. So what we can have, the combination between these two sectors, is an expansion of unreality, the rushing of ideas, perhaps at times some deeper unspoken attitudes and energies could get manifested in a very quick and not necessarily well considered way. So when it comes to romance, but also how we interact in our travels and so forth, we just need to be very much more in touch with sometimes our anxieties, our vulnerabilities, and not project them outwards by, saying, well, no, this is not me, I don't have those things, which is very Sagittarius, about living in the moment, not really looking at the more vulnerable side of things, and thrusting forwards and not really being so in touch with the more feeling side of our existence. So that is a little bit of a challenge. But you know, despite Saturn applying to Venus in that way, it does apply to Jupiter in a very constructive way. And in fact, the first 3 months of this year, Saturn and Jupiter are in a very good relationship, a sextile. Now, why this is so important is Jupiter, of course, is about growth, and Saturn can be about restraint. So when you put the two together in a complementary way, you get a good balance. You get growth that's well thought through, that's step by step, that's not rushing into situations in the way that some of that Sagittarius energy could tempt us to do. So that's very stable. So I think that's basically saying that we can get a greater sense of ourselves, our self-worth, Jupiter in the second house, along with Uranus, but by being in touch with our more spiritual and psychological side, but being at peace with that. So if you're someone who's open to personal development, to working with astrology, really wanting to understand what makes you and others tick in a more profound way, I think this can be a sensational year, because all that Sagittarius energy is certainly going to give us a desire to download a lot more knowledge. But we just need to make sure it's integrated knowledge with that more feeling and spiritual side of our nature. Now, there's one other aspect to tell you about, and you probably have noticed it if you're really into astrology, and that is that Saturn is opposite the moon, but they're both in a T-square with Venus. Now, I've already mentioned Saturn squaring Venus. So what does this mean? I feel that the position of the Sun and Pluto being in Capricorn is obviously very Saturnian because it governs that sign. So to have Saturn applying to the moon, which is in fact a planet that is challenged in the sign of Capricorn, so it's in the Earth sign of Virgo, of course. So it's just saying to us that we need to find a good balance between how we present ourselves in the wider world, which is the Sun in Capricorn, but keep in touch with that feeling dimension, but also see it balancing the physical dimension, which comes from the moon in the 6th house. So, for example, if we use that Mars in Sagittarius to get very, very fit, but we're not in tune with who we are and what our motivations are for doing that, the chances are that there could be some kind of snag or some kind of inhibition that comes up quite quickly. So in other words, we could get very fit, but actually feel a little bit depleted because maybe we're overdoing it. Or we could be someone that works very hard on the spiritual dimension, Saturn, but ignores the physical part of our health. So it's about being really holistic. So it is a big challenge, and I think at times this year, the property market is still going to be quite tight. I think what we're all going to be doing is coming to terms that some resources and products and foodstuffs probably are going to remain a little higher than we would like, definitely higher than we would like, but we are being all asked to become more mindful of the cost of the planet, Saturn, in terms of the quarrying of those resources, and you know who gets the benefits along the way. So certainly Saturn opposite the moon can be quite challenging. It could make things a bit cool at times. There may be times when we feel that our home situation is challenged by the realities of this collective world we live in, because we are all connected within the collective. And that, of course, is where Pluto comes in, which I'm going to share shortly. But I feel that, yes, we're all going to become much more aware of where we are, whether it's to do with the weather, whether it's to do with pollution, whether it's to do with consumption, whether it's to do with the cost of borrowing, whether it's to do with enjoying freely moving around in the world in terms of travel. We're all just going to become much more aware of it. So this can be a growth year, but I must stress with that grand Earth trine, if we're up for embracing the growth in a practical, step-by-step way, appreciating what we've got within the challenges, but also being open to learn new things with all that wonderful Sagittarius energy, but makes sure we stay in tune with how things feel. And that, we've only got to look at the position of Saturn going through the sign of Pisces all through this year to know that that can give us some major new lessons. So clearly, as we step into the new year, initially Mercury in that conjunction with Mars in the sign of Sagittarius does suggest that throughout year 2024, with a whole set of energies unfolding 4 times in fire signs in terms of the Mercury retrograde, there's going to be a lot of passion going around this year, and possibly a lot of desire for, at times, escapism in quite a quick way. So I think travel could be a little bit disrupted by impatience, a lack of preparation, and not just in terms of our own situation, travel systems could be disrupted through year 2024. But by the 2nd of January, Mercury turns direct. But it also is still in its post-retrograde shadow at this time. But I want to really focus on the next truly exciting event of January, which is the return of Pluto to the sign of Aquarius. Now, why this is so symbolically important is that when Pluto was first discovered, they thought its birthday was the 8th of February. But then they were reviewing the plates from the photographs after that event, and they found that it actually was there in the background on the 21st of January. And why this is particularly symbolic is as Pluto returns to Aquarius on its birthday, so does the Sun. So the Sun and Pluto are conjunct in Aquarius, and Pluto is an Aquarius planet. Now, Pluto, of course, is the higher octave ruler of the sign of Scorpio, but its birthday in the sign of Aquarius is very much about regeneration, but also transformation. And I think we would all collectively say that the sign of Aquarius can be to do with those things, often through the rather provocative energies of Uranus, pushing us to try different things, be more experimental, challenge the known approaches, the orthodox, which rather paradoxically is governed by the other ruler of Aquarius, Saturn, which has much more of an appreciation for how things have been over a period of time. But in the first 2.5 degrees of any zodiac sign, the energy of that sign is amplified hugely through a mode of astrology called dwarfs. So the first 2.5 degrees, or the 12th harmonic, gets a higher vibration. Now, what we saw in the 11 weeks that Pluto was in Aquarius in 2023, from the 23rd of March to the 11th of June, a huge conversation went on about artificial intelligence. Now, obviously it's been there for a long time, but it really seemed to come into the public domain in a much more conscious raising way. So I think we can safely say that that is going to be a big part of what we experience this year. And I feel that, of course, that does have some concerns. It also has some opportunities, particularly for things like health screening. It just depends on your viewpoint. You may feel that some things may need to make way, and the potential for Pluto is that it can actually create a new way that the world works, which is actually fairer, because the sign of Aquarius, of course, is about humanity as a whole, and it can be about the higher principle. And that's why Aquarius, even though it's an air sign, has the glyph of the water bearer, because it's linked intrinsically to the concept of baptism, which is basically reaching out, trying to connect to a part or place within us where we can embrace a much higher way of being. So we are going to need to renew ourselves in lots of different ways in the years to come. Pluto is going to rewind back into the sign of Capricorn from the 2nd of September to the 20th of November, but in total spends near to 40 weeks this year in the sign of Aquarius. And then when it comes back into Aquarius later in 24, that's it for the longer term. So we need to buckle up, because it's not going to be a panacea, but I think it is very symbolic that we have that combination on Pluto's birthday. Now, really interestingly, on the 9th of February, we also have a new moon in Aquarius. The 11th house, very much about our friendships, it's about our long-term future, it's about our network, our connections, and those higher principles. And it's forging a link to a lovely link to both the North and the South node. So the South node, it's a trine, the North node, it's a sextile. So that's interesting, because the nodal axis is very much about our direction of travel. Now, by the end of January 2025, the North node will be preparing to go in, the true North node, into the sign of Pisces. And I feel that will be the launch point for really quite a sensational reset that's going to go on for us all. So I still feel that this Aquarius new moon, which is going to be complementing the return of Pluto to Aquarius, and the Sun being in a conjunction, which in itself is an incredibly powerful planetary aspect, that is going to be augmented by this new moon. But also from the 13th of Feb and the 17th of Feb, we have Mars and Venus moving into Aquarius too. Now, we've heard of the concept of the age of Aquarius. I feel that we're really going to be becoming much more aware of how that actually feels, how that's going to play out. So it could be a very exciting time for how we view one another. And because the sign of Aquarius can, in its own way, be a mixture of rebelliousness, continuity, but also purification, not surprising, is it really, with Pluto being born under Aquarius, we may see some of the agendas which have dominated in recent years, which have been a lot to do with dogma, in my humble opinion. You may feel that that's a dogmatic statement, but it's been a lot to do with asserting particular values rather than asserting facts. And one of the things with Aquarius, of course, is it is very much concerned with the higher truth, and that comes from its rulership of Uranus. So really, really interesting that we've got all that Aquarius energy packed into the end of January and the start and ongoingly in February. So really, really important. Now, I mentioned before about the combination of the North Node and Chiron that come together at the end of February, again in the sign of Aries. The sign of Aries, symbolically in astrology, in Western tropical astrology, the whole construct is based on the seasons. So when we get to the spring equinox, that's the new year in astrology. And so what we've got is the North Node is in that first house, which is in some ways a little bit innocent. It wants to encounter things. It's prepared to be a little bit more daring. It can be impulsive, lives in the moment. It can explore. And of course, it's a cardinal sign, so it's very much on the front foot. And we have the node there, which is almost like our collective desire. And I think what it's working towards by the time we get to the end of January 25 is a complete fresh start. But over the time from this forecast at the start of January to the end of January 24, we are going to see a lot of big transformation for sure. So Chiron, of course, is very much to do with where we feel a wound. And people with Chiron in Aries often have a difficulty in feeling a true sense of identity. So as the sun moves into the sign of Aries each spring equinox, this is a new beginning. So what we've got with the North Node connecting with Chiron is a chance for us all to think about our identity. Now, we may be very good at encouraging other people to make the best of their talents, individual flair and artistry. Are we so good at exploring our own? And remember, Chiron is where we can shine to help people, but also feel the pain. So if we feel that our sense of identity is not clear, I think this is a counterpoint to the solar eclipse in the part of our situation to do with our relationships, which occurred on the 14th of October in Libra. And I feel that that has seen us at times losing our sense of identity, but particularly from social media. Now, it just so happens that Facebook started as an Aquarius venture, and obviously its charts progressing, but that's just an example of how we've all connected in the network, and it's been about friendship at its highest point. But what we could say is that maybe at times we've seen how other people are doing. You know, people can definitely project a particular image or portrayal of how they're doing, but that's not necessarily something that's been good for everybody. So I feel that this connection of Chiron and the North Node is reminding us not to be so caught up. It's very good to have good connections with people. It's good to have the balance of the sign of Libra, the fairness, the relationships, but they need to be well balanced. And one of the things we need to get from relationships is our own validation. If we're only seeking that through the messages we get from others, messages, instant messages, then that can leave us rather diluted. So it's a real opportunity at the end of February for sure. But that brings us to the lunar eclipse, which occurs on the 25th of March in Libra. And that, again, is echoing the same theme, I feel, but just in a different way, of that combination between the North Node and Chiron, asking us to be mindful of what we need as individuals. But I feel that this lunar eclipse is reflecting back to the solar eclipses and asking, how's it going in that journey? The next 6 months, we can't spend all of our time trying to people please if we lose what we want to achieve and stand in our own glory in terms of the Aries energy, which is what the North Node and Chiron are pushing us to do, and then the solar eclipse, which occurs on the 8th of April. But I just need to tell you that from the 10th of March through to the 15th of May, Mercury moves through the sign of Aries for 10 weeks. Now that's an extremely long time, and of course this is because of the retrograde, which begins on the 1st of April to the 25th, but we have the pre and the post retrograde periods as well, so another fiery Mercury retrograde. Fire energy is about passion and initiation. So once more, Mercury, which is about the details, can be about communication, ticketing, can of course be about travel, our mode of travel as well, technology, our conversations with people, our connections with neighbours and siblings, a vast variety of qualities that Mercury brings to our lives. But in the sign of Aries, maybe what can happen is that the innocence, or perhaps the presumptuousness at times, and remember Mars, the ruler of Aries, is applying to Mercury at the start of this year on that solar return. So maybe the presumptuousness of Mercury retrograde in Aries could see us try to start something in a bit of a rush, and actually it doesn't quite work out as we would like, because we could rush it. And that takes us back to that solar return point, as I said, between Mercury in its weakest place in the sign of Sagittarius, in that conjunction with Mars, can see us want to go for things very quickly. We can have loads of exuberance and almost overconfidence that everything will work out. But the details, which of course the rulership of Virgo, of Mercury, is very much about, can get missed. So if you are thinking about initiating something from that solar eclipse of the 8th of April, do be aware that Mercury is retrograde, only 5 degrees away, and that can have an impact over the next 6 months. But what I would say to you is this: if you try some things over that 6-month period that don't work out, it isn't necessarily a failure. Because what happens with life experiences is that more information we gain from how things unfold, the more that guides our future moves in a way which is truly right for us. Another thing that I think happens is that sometimes we can have a goal or an ambition and we can work towards it diligently, and once we reach the prize, we realise that however satisfying, it's not actually the thing that we need or want anymore, because we've evolved since we first set out towards that target. So just be aware that if you do try something, get something off the ground from that solar eclipse, and it doesn't ultimately work out, it still is going to be enormously enriching. But I think we could really see some major false starts in the wider world. It won't just be about individuals. It could be a business that starts that quickly crashes and burns. It may be something that everybody gets really enthused about very quickly. It can almost have like a contagion to an idea that everyone's really excited, but then it just fizzles out. And of course, part of the energy of Aries is that it can get a little bit bored after the initial stage. But that then asks us to be mindful of the energy of Uranus and Jupiter in the sign of Taurus, because Taurus is very much the next stage of the journey, because Taurus is about the foundation. It's about the form. You may get the idea with Aries, the initial thrust, but it needs to be shaped up into something more substantive. And sometimes it needs to be slowed down and examined and worked with. And that's where the patient energy of Taurus can be so good. It slows down Jupiter, so it's a little less excessive. But it has to be said that, you know, if you are setting a New Year's resolution to diet in the first 6 months of this year, you may find at times that your willpower is a little challenged, because Jupiter, of course, loves to enjoy good food and good wine, particularly in the sign of Taurus. But we do have Uranus there, which is keeping us honest in a way, because Uranus is about higher truths. In mythology, Uranus rules the sky. Some astrologers think, because Mercury is the ruler of the second decan of Aquarius, and also is exalted in the sign of Aquarius. I feel Aquarius is very much about astrology. Some people feel that Mercury is the ruler of astrology. For me, it's very much Uranus, because it's progressive, it's challenging, it's controversial, it's unsettling. It doesn't always give us what we want. Sometimes it's very provocative. Sound like Aquarius energy? It's more progressive? Absolutely, very Uranian. But we've had a few years to practice working with it. And of course, we had 2 years when Uranus was in a right dust up with its co-regent of Saturn, and that was miserable for us all, and really partly preempted the financial situation we've got, because of course then it got caught up with the Taurus lunar eclipse of the 8th of November 2022. It also clashed with the North Node in the springtime, and again reflecting back to Saturn. So Uranus has not been easy, but I feel that with Jupiter in the sign of Taurus through to the 26th of May, but particularly in its conjunction with Venus, the ruler of Taurus, which becomes exact on the 23rd, that could be a time when the financial machinations that we're all affected by, which are very global, if things aren't going well in China, that affects confidence in the Western markets and vice versa. So I feel that there will be some better outcomes starting to evolve, but there can also be some enrichment in personal relationships, some fortune about individual finance at the end of May. So what very often happens with all planets is that as we practice working with them, we actually get more and more used to extracting the benefits. To begin with, we can be deeply affected by the limitations, but I feel that we are going to see some important developments that are positive at that time. But what about Saturn and Neptune? Now, I mentioned them to you in the solar return, and of course they are afflicting Saturn, Venus and the Moon, and we have Neptune in a dreamy, drifting and perhaps deceptive right angle with Mars and Mercury. So even more important to make sure that we get the details right for all this year, but also that we do submit to the process of integration between our physical and intellectual being, or sides of ourselves, with the more spiritual, psychological and feeling entities that come through the sign of Pisces. And if we're resisting that, Saturn will make it tough, particularly when it goes through its retrograde. Now, I'll just share with you when their retrogrades are going to happen. So Neptune, physical vitality, bit of disorientation, maybe lower spirits. That's from the 2nd of July to the 7th of December. Saturn, in terms of structures, feeling a sense of vulnerability, emotional exhaustion, a resistance to that integration, which is so important, much more concern about anything to do with rivers. We saw when the dam was blown in the Ukraine, that happened with Saturn in Pisces in retrograde. And Saturn's retrograde from the 29th of June to the 15th of November. So, you know, obviously we get retrograde season later in the year, and that can be rather challenging. But I feel that that submission to the principles of Pisces, which is to feel, which is to be compassionate, but Pisces can also be very cold. I actually feel that Pisces has a duality to it that I don't feel often gets noted by other astrologers, to be honest, in the archetypes. It's often seen as being a planet that's about sacrifice, about giving it everything to the causes that really grab the imagination of the individual Pisces. But when the Pisces tunes out, it can be ice cold. And of course, Saturn can emphasize that coldness. So if there are people in your life that are almost like emotional deserts, so when something's going on that you might feel upset about or churned up about or vulnerable about, if you've got people around you that are strictly not listening to where you're coming from at a more spiritual and emotional level, you're going to become much more aware of them. But equally, you can become much more aware of the people who turn everything into a drama, and that therefore in itself becomes exhausting. What we're all wanting is a degree of proportionality. And remember that solar eclipse of the 14th of October 2023 is asking us to keep everything in balance. So very, very important. So that's how I feel the archetypes of Saturn and Neptune will play out. I've explained to you about the North Node as pushing us to reinvigorate our individual identity. It's great to find equilibrium through the energy of Libra, through that solar eclipse last year. It's challenged in March. We could try some new approaches with all that Aquarius energy coming in from the 21st of January with Pluto, the Sun, the new moon, Venus and Mars, some new friendships, new alliances, new principles. We could see, we did hear that comment about the swamp being cleared. Well, we certainly have seen, you know, with all sorts of famous people, some of the stories that have come out in recent years. It's not very edifying, you know, if we can all try to lead our lives in a little bit more of a caring, dignified, courteous, kindly way. Might be very idealistic, but it's very Aquarius, rather than totally purging. So we purge some of the extremes, which is all about ideologies, a very extreme polarities between ideologies, which is not very balanced. So if we can sort of push back against that with that Aquarius energy, that's going to be very healthy. We then get a little bit of a bonus financially or centrally, even though the diet may take a bit of a hit later on in May, but then Jupiter moves into Gemini. So what can we expect from Jupiter in Gemini? Well, the first thing to say is it is technically in detriment. So we have a little bit of an irony, because the year starts with Mercury, the ruler of Gemini, in Sagittarius, governed by Jupiter, and then Jupiter moves into Gemini, which of course is governed by Mercury. So I feel that Jupiter is something that we should always appreciate the qualities of it. And it's not just the ruler of Sagittarius. This is something, again, that's very underestimated. It governs the sign of Pisces. It's the traditional ruler. It is in co-regent along with Neptune, which is currently in Pisces. But Jupiter here is very much about the higher message, faith, spirituality. So the sign of Gemini is very much about the message, the messenger. So Jupiter can, of course, be very exuberant and sometimes to the point of exaggerating the message. So in a world where we really need to kind of get our feet back on the ground in the way we do communicate with one another, I personally think that certainly in terms of all sorts of transactions these days, a lot of human contact is squeezed out of the equation because we're either dealing with instant message bots, or we have to wait for ages to talk to an agent because obviously the seller wants to reduce their cost to create more profit. It's a very inhuman or a very dislocating process. So what we could see is the philosophy that comes from Sagittarius, the spirituality that comes through Jupiter of Pisces, coming back into the way we exchange interactions on a daily basis, which is what Gemini, the third house, is very much about. It's quick exchanges. Of course, Jupiter can be quite jolly through its rulership of Sagittarius, hale and hearty, enthusiastic, can be a bit rushed. And of course, because we've got all that Sagittarius energy at the start of the year, which is pushing us to journey and travel, whether it's physically or through our minds, we can do it in a different way because this is the short message, the short journey, the quick exchange. But we are being asked to bring more integrity to bear in our exchanges. So, sometimes there is a code of conduct. It's not written down anywhere, or it's certainly a modus operandi of the way people communicate, whether it's the way people might set up a wedding, or they might tell people about a happy event, and it's the way people are included or excluded. There's a way that it's done these days, and I feel that Jupiter in Gemini is pushing us all to try to rejuvenate, refresh our approach to those quick exchanges, find a better way of being, the better version of ourselves. Again, very idealistic, very Aquarius, and of course I have a pack of planets in Aquarius. But the interesting thing about Jupiter moving into Gemini is that traditional media has obviously taken quite the hammering, because we all like to be on our smartphones looking up the latest information, whether it's stuff that gives us a bit of a smile on TikTok, or is humorous, or it's very much to do with animals, and it's very, oh, isn't that lovely, that's very sweet, and we share it with our friends. But Jupiter could, in this part of its journey, also push us to convey something that we have a greater investment in. So if you are someone who has ever thought about, writing your memoir or writing a screenplay, you've got that novel that you've always felt you're capable of, with all that Sagittarius energy stacked up at the start of the year, and then Jupiter moving into Gemini from the 26th of May, that gives us a fabulous opportunity to express our ideas. We've just got to find a way to do it which is more rooted in sincerity and decency. That's my personal view. You may feel that I'm infinitely innocent and naive, which you may have a point about, but we have to have some kind of reset to our moral compass. Now, it used to be when I was a kid that essentially the church was the moral compass. And of course, now society has shifted and changed. It's so much more inclusive in a really positive way. But some of those values have made way, and maybe they did need to adapt. But we've also had a bit of a vacuum because no one checks any information. So no one holds anyone to account. So one of the things that Jupiter is about through Sagittarius is justice. So we may see some greater scrutiny start to develop through some source of media over the following months from the 26th of May. But of course, Gemini also has a reputation of being very quick-witted, very much the magician, not always very consistent, a bit cunning, very funny. And Jupiter can exacerbate and exaggerate perhaps those less favourable characteristics of the sign of Gemini, but it also gives us an opportunity, as every planet, every position always does. But it's quite exciting, and I think in the second half of this year we're going to see a lot of information come into the public domain about how we move around, about our exercise regime, the third house, quick, sharp exercise, could be about our thinking, our belief systems, the code of conduct around publishing generally. There could be new information and new ways or new desire to do things in a more noble way, in my humble opinion. So that brings us to the part of the year when Mercury is going to be making its way through the sign of Leo and Virgo. Now, the retrograde in Leo is for 13 days in August, and on the 28th of August goes into retrograde. On the 15th it goes direct. So obviously Leo energy is very much about demonstrativeness. It can be social interaction, can be fantastic creativity. And Virgo energy, which of course Mercury rules, very much about the precision and discrimination and making sure that things are very efficient. And of course the year started with the moon in Virgo as well. So there's going to be a little bit of a sludgy period through the summer, I feel, where communications may not run that sweetly. But it's interesting because the retrogrades to Mercury in year 2023 were all earth signs, apart from the last week, which it was Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius. So what's happening, we're getting a little bit of a repeat here of Mercury's retrograde through Virgo. So will be important if we're planning anything to do with a date, socializing, an event, that we really ensure the precision is really up to speed. Which brings us to the lunar eclipse, which is going to occur on the 18th of September in the sign of Pisces. So we've got a new eclipse series coming in. And Neptune is a drifting, dreamy, very gassy influence. It's one of the most fascinating in astrology, I feel. Also, of course, very much the trident to do with the sea, the oceans. So there's going to be a lot of discussion at this part of the year and the last 3 or 4 months about pollution and about plastics, chemicals. One of the issues with Neptune in Pisces is we don't necessarily see what's not good for us. You know, the classic example of how this has worked into all our systems is the stuff that essentially first came into being through non-scratch cookware. I won't mention the brand, you probably know what I'm talking about, but that product is used in car seats, in furniture. It's absolutely everywhere, and apparently we all have that chemical. Pretty well all of us, all out the world, have that chemical in us, even if we are avoiding utensils that have got that plastic coating, or any product. We're trying our best to use items that are more natural. Apparently it still gets into our system. So those kind of things are going to become much more discussed on this eclipse series for sure. I'm not saying they're not being discussed already. A lot of people are very aware about it and rightly very concerned and very angry about the amount of chemicals that are within the food chain, the water table and so forth. And it does seem to be that is causing a lot more carcinogenic energies to work into our bodies. So that is something we are going to become mindful of, but it's also another reminder that we got from that opposition between Saturn and the Moon at the start of the year about not ignoring the physical plane nor the emotional plane. We need to integrate them. And because Neptune can be disguised, it can be mysterious, it's not necessarily tangible, not necessarily something we can grab hold of, that's going to be a fascinating lunar eclipse. And it could bring a lot of emotional pain that is washing around many of us. It could bring it really into the astral spotlight, and it's a chance to heal. But that brings us to the solar eclipse in the sign of Libra on the 2nd of October, and this is conjunct Mercury, but it's not retrograde. So a wonderful opportunity to really think about the whole concept of fairness, balance, how we relate, how we listen, how skillful we are at being inclusive, how we look to have more nurturing alliances. It's not necessarily about giving away our power completely. It's not being about too much of a people pleaser. It's about finding that midpoint between the give and get. And that really takes us into the last phase of the year. But I want to tell you about Mars, because Mars from the 4th of November to the year's end is in the sign of Leo, and it goes retrograde from the 6th of December. So that is going to be a big part of how we go into 24, the Mars retrograde. It actually rewinds back into the sign of Virgo. So again, being asked to be much more aware of the physical plane. But of course, Mars in Libra can be very demonstrative. We've seen that in year 2023 when it had its 6-week cycle through Mars, and that happened to coincide at the start of July, not in an exact conjunction with Venus, which had that extended journey because of the retrograde in Leo. And Mars in Leo energy is very much about showcasing talent, and it likes a degree of recognition. So as we come to the end of this year, Mars is in retrograde. So Mercury then returns to the sign of Sagittarius on the 12th of November. And the retrograde from the 26th of November to the 15th of December sees Mercury emerge from the retrograde, but it will still be in its post-retrograde shadow as the curtain comes down on the year. So Mercury's going to teach us a lot of lessons this year about passion, how we convey ideas, rushing things, particularly with that conjunction with Mars, but also the square with Neptune. We need to have our facts straight before we opine. And also, if we're traveling anywhere, we need to be aware of the pitfalls to any journey and we might go on, because I do feel that there will be at times this year some kind of disruption around transport or distribution systems, and of course that can include pedestrian travel as well, sort of individual travel. But there's also a lot of excitement for this year because we do have that grand Earth trine at the start of the year, which suggests that if we keep at it in a patient and persistent way with the support of Jupiter, we can slowly but surely get a little bit more equilibrium into our situation as the year develops. The North Node and Chiron and the solar eclipse in Aries are really encouraging us to live our best version of ourselves, but there is a big transformation for us all collectively coming through the sign of Aquarius, undoubtedly. And then we do get a new eclipse series emerging in September, and then another wonderful opportunity to balance what we need as individuals, the Aries energy, with how we connect with one another. So the big question for this year is the quality of our communication. Can we bring a little bit more sobriety to bear? Can we bring a little bit more dignity to bear? Can we measure our message in a more thoughtful way? Can we be a little less hasty to express a point of view? I think there are certain elements of this situation this year that could make that challenging, but the direction of travel is that we all need to reach into a higher version collectively of our potential as a race, and that actually is going to be very important for our future prosperity and security, because if we don't alter some things, we're going to go along the lines of polarity and very warlike stances, which has a lot of abrasion and a lot of insecurity for us all. So we all need to really more collectively integrate our physical and emotional planes, and there are real opportunities to grow this year if we can. It's been a real pleasure being with you. I'd be honoured if you would subscribe. I do try to interact with as many comments as possible. This is very much a community, and if you would kindly share, that would be lovely too. So all the best for year 2024, and don't forget your in-depth, deep dive forecast for each of the 12 signs from Aries through to Pisces. The links for those are underneath this video.